I never thought a single sentence could end a family, but mine did. It was just 8 words, delivered with a smile across my mother's dining room table, and everything changed. They laughed when my sister said she wished I'd never been born. The whole table erupted, my father nearly choking on his chocolate cake, my mother giggling behind her napkin, my older sister slapping the table in delight. Everyone thought it was hilarious. Everyone except me. I put my fork down slowly, the sound of metal on china cutting through their laughter like a knife. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, but I kept my face calm, serene even. I looked at each of them, my father still chuckling, my mother wiping tears from her eyes, my sisters grinning like they'd just delivered the punchline of the century. Then I spoke. 8 words. That's all it took. The room went silent, so fast you could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. The laughter died like someone had cut the power. Forks stopped moving. I watched confusion spread across their faces as they tried to process what I'd just said. Why wasn't I laughing along like I always did? Why wasn't I deflecting with self-deprecating humor or changing the subject like a good little peacekeeper I'd been trained to be? I stood up slowly, folded my napkin, placed it beside my half-eaten cake, and walked out. I was 32 years old, and I would never see that dining room again for over a decade. Let me take you back to how we got there, Dot. My name is Catherine, and I'm the middle child of 3 daughters. The invisible one. The forgotten one. The daughter who never quite measured up to anyone's expectations. My older sister Jessica has always been the golden child successful lawyer, married to a doctor named Mark, 2 perfect children, house in the suburbs that looks like something from a magazine spread. Every family gathering was an opportunity for her to showcase her latest achievement, whether it was winning a high-profile case, her daughter's acceptance into advanced programs, or her son's athletic victories. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had always been told she was exceptional, and she was. Just not in the ways that actually mattered for building real human connections. My younger sister, Amanda, is the baby, the creative soul, the artistic one who can do no wrong despite being 28 and living in her parents' basement while pursuing her passion projects. She had that artistic temperament that allowed her to be moody, unreliable, and self-absorbed while everyone excused it as part of her creative nature. She could miss family obligations, forget birthdays, show up late to everything, and it was always forgiven because she was following her artistic muse. The rules that applied to Jessica and me never seemed to apply to Amanda. And there's me. High school English teacher, divorced, no kids. Living in a modest apartment across town. By most standards, I wasn't unsuccessful. I had a stable career. I was good at my job. I paid my bills on time. I had a small circle of friends. But in my family, I might as well have been invisible. I was the afterthought, the reliable one who showed up to everything, brought thoughtful gifts, remembered every birthday, listened to everyone's problems without ever complaining. I was the designated keeper of family peace, always smoothing over conflicts, making sure everyone felt heard and valued. Everyone except myself. I can't count how many times I mediated between Jessica and Amanda when they fought, or listened to my mother complain about feeling unappreciated while she literally failed to appreciate me in the same breath. I was the family therapist, the event coordinator, the emotional support system, all rolled into one convenient, invisible package. The dinner that changed everything was supposed to celebrate Jessica's promotion to senior partner at her law firm. Mom had pulled out all the stop's best china, homemade lasagna, the works. She'd spent 3 days preparing, and the house smelled amazing when I arrived. I'd brought a nice bottle of wine and a congratulations card with a thoughtful message inside. Jessica barely glanced at it when I handed it to her, already deep in conversation with Dad about the details of her new position. Dad beamed with pride as Jessica told stories about her courtroom victories and the new BMW she was considering. She had brought a tablet with her and showed us photos of the car she was looking at, talking about leather seats and advanced safety features and the status it would convey to her clients. Mom oohed and ahed appropriately, already planning the party she'd throw when Jessica actually purchased it. Amanda showed off her latest paintings on her phone while everyone gathered around, praising her unique perspective and raw talent. The paintings were abstract, lots of dark colors with slashes of red, and everyone talked about how they captured something profound about the human experience. I thought they looked like every other amateur abstract painting I'd ever seen. But I kept that opinion to myself and added my compliments to the chorus of praise. I mentioned that one of my students had won a regional writing contest I'd helped coach her for. It barely registered a polite nod from anyone. Jessica said, "That's nice," without looking up from her phone. Amanda didn't seem to hear me at all, and my parents were already turning back to ask Jessica another question about her promotion. This was nothing new. I'd grown used to being the supporting character in everyone else's story. The conversation flowed in its usual pattern. Jessica dominated with tales of her work, her husband Mark's new hospital position, their daughter Emma's acceptance into a gifted program, their son Tyler's soccer achievements. She talked about how they were considering buying a vacation home, maybe something in the mountains where they could ski in the winter. She'd already been looking at properties and showed us photos of massive log cabin-style houses that cost more than I'd earn in a lifetime of teaching. Dad was practically bursting with pride, talking about how he always knew she'd be successful, how she'd shown ambition even as a little girl. Amanda discussed her latest creative project at length, a series of abstract paintings about trauma and healing that she hoped to show at a local gallery. She talked about her artistic vision, about how she was exploring the intersection of pain and beauty, about how important it was to stay true to her creative impulses even when the world didn't understand. She'd been working on this series for 18 months, she said, really diving deep into her own psyche to pull out these raw emotional truths. Mom listened with rapt attention, asking thoughtful questions about her process and her inspiration. When the conversation briefly turned to me, I mentioned considering going back to school for my master's degree in education administration, maybe moving into a leadership role eventually. It was something I'd been seriously considering for months. I'd been researching programs, looking at costs, thinking about how it might change my career trajectory. I wanted to have a bigger impact, to influence education policy, and help more students than I could reach in a single classroom. "Oh, that's nice, honey," Mom said absently, already turning back to Jessica. "Jess, tell us more about that case you won last week." The familiar sting of dismissal hit me, but I pushed it down like I always did. I'd learned decades ago not to expect attention or praise from my family. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was secure in my own worth, that I didn't need their validation. I was lying to myself, but I'd gotten good at that over the years. I perfected the art of convincing myself that I was fine, that their neglect didn't hurt, that I was above needing their approval. Then came dessert. Mom served her famous chocolate cake, the same one she'd made for special occasions since we were kids. It was rich and decadent, with thick chocolate frosting and layers of filling. She'd made it for every birthday, every holiday, every celebration for as long as I could remember. She served generous slices to everyone, and we all dug in with appreciation. The conversation turned to childhood memories, and that's when things started to unravel. Jessica and Amanda were laughing about pranks they pulled as teenagers, stories I'd heard 100 times before. There was the time they'd rearranged all the furniture in the living room while our parents were out. The time they'd convinced the neighbors that we were moving and had people showing up to say goodbye. The time they'd created a fake newsletter about our street and distributed it to everyone, filled with ridiculous gossip they'd made up. Everyone thought these stories were hilarious evidence of their creativity and sense of humor. Remember when we convinced Catherine she was adopted? Amanda giggled through a mouthful of cake. The table erupted in laughter. Everyone except me. I remembered that joke far too well. I was 12, awkward, insecure, trying to figure out where I fit in the world. It was that terrible age where everything feels uncertain, where your body is changing in ways you don't understand, where you're desperate to belong somewhere, anywhere. My sister spent weeks dropping hints that I was adopted, pointing out how different I looked from them, how my interests didn't match theirs, how I didn't really fit with the family. They said I had different shaped eyes, a different nose, different mannerisms. They pointed out that I liked reading while they preferred sports and art. They whispered to each other when I walked by, then stopped abruptly when I got close enough to hear. They told me they'd found adoption papers in the attic, but wouldn't show them to me. It devastated me. I cried myself to sleep for weeks, wondering if it was true, feeling even more like an outsider than I already did. I studied family photos looking for evidence either way. I compared my features to everyone else's obsessively. I felt untethered, like I didn't belong anywhere. When I finally worked up the courage to ask our parents, they'd laughed it off as harmless sibling teasing. No one seemed to understand how deeply it had cut me. "That was so mean of you girls," Mom said now, smiling as she spoke. Poor Catherine was so upset that she was smiling like it was a fond memory rather than a cruel episode. "She was so gullible," Jessica added, shaking her head with amusement. "She actually believed us for months. It was harmless fun. Remember how she'd look at us with those big sad eyes, trying to figure out if we were telling the truth?" "Kids will be kids," Dad chimed in, chuckling. "You girls always did have a mischievous streak." I forced a smile and took a bite of cake that tasted like cardboard in my mouth. This was how it always went. My pain was minimized, dismissed as overreaction or hypersensitivity. I was expected to laugh along with jokes at my expense, to be the good sport who took everything in stride. If I ever tried to express how much something had hurt me, I was told I was being too sensitive, that I needed to learn to take a joke, that I couldn't expect the world to tiptoe around my feelings. The stories continued, each one a little dagger. More childhood memories, more laughter at my expense. The time they convinced me that if I made a certain face, it would stick that way permanently, which led to me being terrified to express any emotion for weeks. The time they told me the ice cream truck only played music when it was out of ice cream, so I never asked for any and watched sadly as they got treats. The time they hid all my stuffed animals and told me they'd run away because I wasn't taking good enough care of them, which sent me into a panic, thinking I'd failed at the one responsibility I'd been given. The time they told me that I had to hold my breath whenever we drove past a cemetery or I'd breathe in dead people's souls, and I nearly passed out in the car. The time they convinced me that I was allergic to water and could only drink milk, which led to a very confused conversation with my teacher when I refused to drink from the water fountain at school. Each story was told with fond amusement, as if these were cherished family memories rather than a systematic pattern of psychological torment that had shaped my entire sense of self-worth. I sat there, fork moving mechanically, feeling smaller and smaller with each anecdote. These were the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, and yet they seemed to take genuine pleasure in recounting all the ways they'd made me miserable as a child. What struck me most was how they framed these memories. They weren't stories about how they'd been cruel. They were stories about how gullible I was, how sensitive, how easy to fool. I was the punchline over and over again, and I was expected to laugh along, to be grateful that they were including me in the conversation at all, even if it was only as the butt of their jokes. Then Amanda said it. She was laughing particularly hard at a story about how they'd convinced me I could only speak on weekends when I was 7, which resulted in me being completely silent at school for 3 days before my teacher called home in concern. They thought it was hilarious that I'd taken their rule so seriously that I'd gotten in trouble at school for refusing to participate in class discussions. My teacher had been worried something was seriously wrong, and when my parents had finally figured out what was happening, they just told me not to believe everything my sister said, but they hadn't punished Jessica or Amanda at all. She looked at me with that expression I knew so well, the one that meant she was about to deliver what she thought was a hilarious punchline. Her eyes were sparkling with mischief and too much wine, her cheeks flushed from laughing. Honestly, she said, wiping tears of laughter from her eyes, sometimes I wish you were never born. Our childhood would have been so much more fun without you being such a buzzkill all the time. You were always crying about something, always taking things too seriously, always running to mom and dad. You couldn't take a joke then, and you probably still can't now. The room erupted. Dad nearly choked on his cake. Mom giggled behind her napkin. Jessica slapped the table, her bracelet clanging against the wood. Oh my God, Amanda, Jessica managed between laughs. That's terrible, but kind of true. But I wasn't laughing. Something inside me that had been bending for 32 years finally snapped. I put my fork down slowly. The clink seemed abnormally loud in the midst of their hilarity. My heart raced, pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, feel it in my fingertips. But I smiled. The calmest, most serene smile I'd ever managed in my life. The laughter still echoed around the table as I looked directly at Amanda, then swept my gaze across each of their faces. Dad's face was red from laughing. Mom had actual tears running down her cheeks. Jessica was gasping for breath. Amanda was grinning triumphantly. They looked so happy, so unified in their amusement at my expense. And something in me just let go. All the years of trying to earn their love, all the effort I'd put into being good enough, all the times I'd swallowed my hurt to keep the peace, it all released at once. Then I said it. Well, Amanda, the feeling is mutual. The only difference is I actually have the power to make that wish come true. The silence was instant and total. The laughter died as if someone had flipped a switch. Forks stopped moving. Breathing seemed to pause. The only sound was the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I watched the smiles freeze on their faces, watched confusion creep in around the edges of their expressions. Jessica's mouth was still open, caught mid-laugh. Amanda's grin faltered, then disappeared completely. Mom's hand was still holding her napkin to her face. Dad's eyes went wide. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed to echo forever in the silent room. I folded my napkin neatly, taking my time with it, creasing the edges just so, and placed it beside my half-eaten slice of cake. My hands were steady. That surprised me. Inside I was shaking, but my hands were perfectly steady. Thank you for dinner, Mom. It was enlightening. My voice came out calm, almost pleasant. I picked up my purse from where I'd hung it on the back of my chair and walked to the front door, my heels clicking steadily on the floor. Behind me, someone called my name. I think it was Dad. His voice sounded uncertain, confused, maybe just starting to realize that something significant had shifted. I didn't turn around. I walked out, closing the door quietly behind me, and drove home in complete silence, my hands steady on the wheel, even though my whole body was trembling. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't cry. I just drove through the familiar streets. Past the park where I used to play as a child, past my old elementary school, past all the landmarks of the life I was already beginning to leave behind. That night, I sat in my apartment with a cup of tea and really thought about what had happened. For the first time in my life, I'd stood up for myself. I'd refused to be the family punching bag, the reliable doormat who absorbed everyone else's cruelty with a smile. And it felt incredible. Terrifying, but incredible. My hands were shaking as I held my teacup, the reality of what I'd done starting to sink in. But underneath the fear was something else, a sense of rightness, of finally speaking a truth that had needed to be spoken for decades. But I also knew this was just the beginning. If I was serious about what I'd said, about having the power to make Amanda's wish come true, then I needed to follow through. I needed to actually remove myself from their lives in a way that would make them understand what they'd lost. Words alone wouldn't be enough. I'd stood up to them before in smaller ways, expressing hurt, asking them to stop, trying to explain how their behavior affected me, and it had never made a difference. They'd always dismissed my feelings, told me I was too sensitive, and continued doing exactly what they'd always done. This time had to be different. This time I had to actually leave, not just threaten to leave. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day researching job opportunities in other cities. I'd been thinking about making a change anyway, feeling stagnant in my current position, wondering if there was more I could be doing with my career. Now seemed like the perfect time. Within a week, I'd apply for teaching positions in Seattle, Portland, and Denver, all far enough away to make casual visits impossible. I crafted careful cover letters explaining my interest in each position, highlighting my experience and my desire for new challenges. I updated my resume, contacted references, and threw myself into the application process with an intensity that surprised me. While I waited to hear back, I began systematically removing myself from my family's life. I changed my phone number without giving them the new one. The woman at the phone store looked at me sympathetically when I explained I needed a completely new number, not just a change. "Fresh start?" she asked. "Something like that," I replied. I deactivated my Facebook account, my primary connection to extended family and old friends. I stopped responding to emails. My inbox filled with increasingly frantic messages from my mother, from Jessica, even from Amanda. "Catherine, please call me. We need to talk about what happened. I don't understand why you're so upset. It was just a joke. You're being ridiculous. Call Mom, she's worried sick." I deleted them all without responding. When Jessica called the school looking for me, I had the secretary tell her I was unavailable. The secretary, Mrs. Henderson, was a kind woman in her 60s who had worked at the school for decades. She must have heard something in my voice when I asked her to screen my calls because she didn't ask questions, just patted my hand and said, "Don't worry, dear. I'll take care of it." When Mom showed up at my apartment, I simply didn't answer the door. I stood on the other side, listening to her knock, listening to her call my name, listening to her finally give up and leave. It was harder than I'd expected. Every instinct I had screamed at me to open the door, to fix things, to make her feel better. But I held firm. 3 weeks after the dinner, Roosevelt High School in Seattle called. They wanted to interview me for a position teaching advanced English literature. The salary was better than what I was making, and they offered relocation assistance. The principal, Dr. Sarah Chun, sounded enthusiastic on the phone. "Your application stood out," she told me. "We're looking for someone who can bring fresh perspectives to our program, and your experience with coaching students and writing competitions is exactly what we need." I took the job. The interview was conducted over video call, and I must have said all the right things because they offered me the position on the spot. I gave my current school 4 weeks' notice, telling them I received an opportunity I couldn't pass up. My principal was disappointed but understanding. "You're a talented teacher, Catherine," he told me. "Seattle's lucky to have you, but you'll be missed here." My colleagues threw me a small farewell party in the teacher's lounge. Several students wrote me touching thank you notes, telling me how much my classes had meant to them, how I'd helped them discover a love of literature or find their voice in writing. One student, a quiet girl named Maria who'd struggled with confidence, wrote, "You were the first teacher who ever made me feel like what I had to say mattered. Thank you for seeing me." I cried reading that note, realizing that I'd given these students something my own family had never given me. It was the kind of warm send-off I'd never received from my own family. I hired movers, forwarded my mail to a post office box, and within 6 weeks of that dinner, I was gone. The day I left town, I drove past my parents' house one last time. Mom's car was in the driveway. I could see lights on in the living room. For just a moment, I felt a pull to stop, to go inside, to try one more time to make them understand. But I kept driving. Some relationships aren't fixable, and I was finally accepting that truth. But I wasn't just disappearing. I was transforming. In Seattle, I threw myself into my new life with energy I hadn't felt in years. The city was beautiful, nestled between the water and the mountains, full of coffee shops and bookstores and parks. The school where I taught was diverse and vibrant, with students who were eager to learn and colleagues who valued collaboration. For the first time in my professional life, I felt like I was part of a real team rather than just another cog in the machine. I joined a hiking group and discovered I loved being outdoors. The Pacific Northwest was perfect for hiking, with trails ranging from easy walks to challenging climbs. Every weekend, I'd head out with a group, breathing in the pine-scented air, pushing my body up steep inclines, rewarding myself with stunning views from mountain peaks. The physical challenge was exactly what I needed, something concrete to work toward, something where my effort directly resulted in progress. I took a creative writing class at a local community center and found I had real talent for storytelling. The instructor, a published novelist named Marcus, encouraged me to keep writing. "You have a gift for capturing emotional truth," he told me after reading one of my short stories about a woman starting over in a new city. "This feels real because it is real. Keep going with this." I started dating again, meeting people who appreciated my quiet sense of humor and genuine interest in others. There was Daniel, the architect who took me to art galleries and taught me about building design. There was James, the chef who cooked elaborate meals and made me laugh with stories about kitchen disasters. There was Patrick, the musician who played guitar and sang me songs he had written. None of them turned into serious relationships, but each one taught me something about what I wanted and what I deserved. For the first time in my adult life, I was surrounded by people who valued me. My new colleagues respected my teaching methods and sought out my advice. Sarah Chun, the principal who'd hired me, became a mentor of sorts. She'd invite me to her office to brainstorm about curriculum changes or discuss challenging student situations. "You have good instincts," she told me. "Don't second-guess yourself so much." My students responded to my passion for literature with enthusiasm I'd rarely seen before. We read diverse authors, discussed complex themes, and created a classroom environment where every voice mattered. One of my students, a young man named Deshaun, who'd been labeled as difficult by previous teachers, blossomed in my class. He turned out to have a brilliant analytical mind and a gift for connecting literature to current events. "You're the first teacher who ever listened to me," he told me at the end of the semester. The hiking group welcomed me warmly, and I quickly made friends who actually enjoyed my company. There was Maria, a software engineer with a wicked sense of humor. Tom, a librarian who could quote literature as readily as I could. Jennifer, a nurse who had the most infectious laugh I'd ever heard. We'd meet for happy hour after our hikes, sharing stories and jokes and supporting each other through life's ups and downs. I began to realize how much of my personality had been suppressed by constantly trying to fit into my family's dynamic. Without their constant, subtle undermining, I flourished. I started a blog about teaching literature that gained a small but dedicated following. I wrote about innovative ways to engage students with classic texts, about the importance of diverse voices in the curriculum, about how to create classrooms where all students felt valued. Teachers from around the country started commenting, sharing their own experiences, asking for advice. It felt good to be building something positive, to be contributing to a larger conversation about education. I enrolled in an online master's program in educational leadership and began working toward my degree part-time. The coursework was challenging but invigorating. I'd come home from work, eat dinner, and spend my evenings reading about educational theory, writing papers about school improvement strategies, participating in online discussions with other educators. I was intellectually stimulated in a way I hadn't been in years. After 3 years in Seattle, I was promoted to assistant principal. Sarah was retiring and she'd recommended me for the position. "You're ready for this," she told me. "You've grown so much since you arrived here. I'm proud of you." 2 years after that, I became a full principal at a different school in the district, a larger building with more students and more challenges. It was exactly the kind of leadership role I'd dreamed about, but never quite believed I could achieve. The transformation wasn't just professional. It was deeply personal. For the first time in my life, I was discovering who I really was when I wasn't constantly trying to manage other people's emotions or make myself smaller to avoid conflict. I realized I was actually funny, not in a self-deprecating way, but genuinely witty. My hiking friends loved my dry observations about trail conditions and fellow hikers. You know, it's a challenging hike when the trail description says rewarding views. I'd say, and everyone would laugh because it was true. That's code for you'll want to die halfway up, but the summit makes it almost worth it. My colleagues appreciated my ability to find humor in the chaos of high school drama. When a student tried to convince me that his dog had eaten his homework literally using that exact excuse in the age of computers, I responded, "I admire your commitment to classic tropes, but you're going to need to try harder. Maybe blame it on a computer virus." The student had laughed, admitted he'd just forgotten, and we'd worked out a plan for him to turn it in late with partial credit. I'd never been allowed to be funny at home, because humor was Jessica and Amanda's territory. I'd learned early that trying to compete would only result in being shut down, or worse, having my jokes explained back to me as if I hadn't understood what I was trying to say. In Seattle, people laughed with me, not at me. They got my humor and appreciated it. I discovered I was passionate about social justice issues. I started volunteering at a local literacy center, helping adult learners improve their reading skills. Many of my students were immigrants working multiple jobs while trying to learn English well enough to advance in their careers or help their children with homework. Their determination inspired me. I organized fundraisers for classroom supplies in underprivileged schools, reaching out to local businesses for donations and coordinating volunteer efforts. I joined a local chapter of Teachers for Educational Equity, attending meetings and advocating for policy changes that would benefit all students, not just those in wealthy districts. These weren't things I'd ever had time for before. When every weekend was consumed with family obligations and emotional labor, I'd spent so much energy managing my family's dysfunction that I'd had nothing left for the causes I actually cared about. Now, freed from that burden, I could direct my energy toward things that mattered to me. Most surprisingly, I found out I was actually quite social. Back home, I'd been labeled the quiet one, the introvert who preferred books to people. But that had been a survival mechanism, a way to avoid drawing attention that might result in ridicule. In Seattle, surrounded by people who actually listened when I spoke and valued what I had to say, I blossomed into someone who genuinely enjoyed hosting dinner parties, organizing group outings, and building deep friendships. I'd host potlucks where everyone brought a dish and we'd spend hours talking and laughing. I'd organize movie nights and game nights and impromptu weekend trips to the coast. I was the person who remembered everyone's birthdays and organized surprise celebrations. I was the one people called when they needed to talk through a problem or just wanted company. I'd become, in my new life, exactly the kind of caring, connected person I'd tried to be for my family, except now it was reciprocated. The people I cared for cared back about 18 months after I moved. I was hosting a potluck dinner for my hiking group when someone made a joke about their own family drama. The group started sharing stories about difficult relatives, boundary setting, and family dysfunction. It was one of those conversations that starts light and gradually gets deeper as people realize they're in a safe space to be vulnerable. My mom guilt trips me every time I can't make it to Sunday dinner, Jennifer said. She acts like I'm personally attacking her if I have other plans. My brother still owes me $5,000 from 3 years ago, Tom added, and he acts like I'm the jerk for bringing it up. I found myself telling them about my situation, not for sympathy, but as part of a genuine conversation among equals. I told them about the dinner, about Amanda's comment, about my response and my decision to leave. I told them about the years of being treated as less than, about the constant dismissal and ridicule. Wait, said Maria, one of my favorite hiking companions, setting down her wine glass. They actually convinced you that you were adopted as a form of entertainment? For months? When you were 12. I nodded. I was 12 and going through that awkward phase where you're already questioning everything about yourself. It was devastating. That's not teasing, said Tom, shaking his head firmly. That's psychological abuse. The word hit me like lightning. Abuse? I'd never thought of it that way. Abuse was hitting and screaming, wasn't it? Abuse was dramatic and obvious and left visible marks. What my family had done was subtle, insidious, easy to dismiss as just normal sibling rivalry or family dynamics. But as my new friends talked about emotional manipulation, gaslighting, and systematic degradation, I began to see my childhood through a different lens. It's called scapegoating, Maria said. She worked in tech but had minored in psychology. When a family system is dysfunctional, they often designate one person as the problem, the scapegoat. That person absorbs all the family's negative energy so the system can maintain its equilibrium. It's incredibly damaging. And the fact that they can't function without you now? Jennifer added, that's because you were doing all the emotional labor. You were the one holding everything together, and they took that completely for granted. I felt something crack open inside me, not in a breaking way, but in a letting light in way. They were right. I'd spent my whole life being the family scapegoat, the emotional caretaker, the invisible support system. And I'd accepted that role because I didn't know any better, because it was all I'd ever known. I started reading books about family dynamics and emotional abuse. I read Toxic Parents by Susan Forward, Children of Emotionally Immature Parents by Lindsay Gibson, Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents by the same author. I read about narcissistic family systems, about golden children and scapegoats, about how emotional abuse works and why it's so hard for victims to recognize. I learned about scapegoating and how families use one number as a repository for all their dysfunction. I discovered terms like emotional parentification, which perfectly described how I'd been expected to manage everyone else's feelings from a young age while my own were dismissed or ignored. I learned about triangulation, where family members communicate through a third party rather than directly with each other, and I realized I'd been that third party my entire life. The more I read, the angrier I became. Not the desperate, powerless anger I'd felt at that dinner table, but a clean, righteous anger that burned away the last vestiges of guilt I'd been carrying about abandoning my family. This wasn't normal family dysfunction. This wasn't just sibling rivalry or personality clashes. This was systematic emotional abuse, and I had every right to protect myself from it. I hadn't abandoned them. I'd escaped them. This revelation coincided with interesting intelligence I was getting about their reactions to my disappearance. Through social media connections and mutual acquaintances, word was starting to filter back to me about how my absence was affecting them. It started small. My cousin Rachel, who I'd always liked, mentioned in a casual Facebook comment on a mutual friend's post that family gatherings were weird now. She didn't elaborate, but I could read between the lines. A former high school classmate, Beth, told me she'd run into Jessica at the grocery store, and Jessica had seemed really stressed, kept asking if she'd heard from me, seemed almost frantic about it. She looked terrible, Beth reported. Like she hadn't been sleeping. She grabbed my arm in the frozen food aisle and practically begged me to contact her if I heard anything from you. It was uncomfortable, but the most revealing information came from Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor from my childhood home. She'd always been kind to me, the type of neighbor who'd invite me over for cookies and actually listen when I talked. When she saw my name on a teaching award announcement that had been shared in the local newspaper, someone from my old school had nominated me for a state level recognition. She sent a letter to my school, which they forwarded to me. "Catherine, dear," she wrote in her neat, old-fashioned script, "I was so proud to see your accomplishment in the paper. I always knew you were special, even when I sensed you were struggling at home. I hope you don't mind me reaching out, but I wanted you to know that your mother has been asking everyone in the neighborhood if we've heard from you. She seems quite beside herself with worry. She's lost weight, and I've seen her crying on the porch more than once. I told her I'd try to find a way to let you know she's thinking of you. I hope you're doing well wherever you are." I stared at that letter for a long time. Part of me felt a flicker of the old guilt, the trained response to put everyone else's feelings before my own. Mom was suffering, and my first instinct was still to want to fix that, to take away her pain, even if it meant sacrificing my own well-being. But I'd learned enough about healthy boundaries to recognize that my mother's distress was not my responsibility to fix, especially when it was the natural consequence of her own choices. She'd allowed my sisters to torment me for years. She'd laughed when Amanda said she wished I'd never been born. She'd dismissed my feelings and my pain over and over again. Her current suffering, while real, was something she brought upon herself. I wrote back to Mrs. Patterson, thanking her for the kind words and asking her to let my